Hi all, I'm Craig Mulholland. I'm the CEO of Apex Advice Group here in Auckland, and Mark's asked me to come and talk to you today about board papers. How much is too much?
Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. My name is Mark Banicevich, and as you just heard, today I get the pleasure to spend some time with Craig Mulholland. He's actually a little bit modest in his introduction there. He's also been General Counsel at ANZ, Managing Director of ANZ Wealth Management, General Counsel or Company Secretary at Telecom.
Both, yeah.
So, very long career in executive level, and now CEO, as he says, of Apex Advice. So really great pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you very much, Craig.
Absolute pleasure.
Board papers, having participated as you have in lots of board meetings, how many agenda items do you usually see in a good board meeting?
Again, it really depends on the organisation, the size of it, the complexity, whether it's a one-off meeting or whether it's a quarterly meeting or ad hoc. But I think in your standard meeting, I think no more than 8 to 10 items is probably about right. Now, take out your usual approval of minutes and actions and those sorts of things. If you've got sort of substantive 8 papers, that's probably about right.
That's a pretty chunky meeting. And how long would those meetings tend to last?
A short meeting is a good meeting. I think if all the directors have prepared really, really well for it, then it can be shorter. But I've been in big listed companies where the meetings run over 2 or 3 days with committees and all the other meetings. For private companies, it can be a couple of hours. But I think 1 to 2 hours for a standing meeting is quite good. But if you do need more, then you should take more time.
And having served as Company Secretary, how big do the board packs tend to be?
Some very large. For large companies, when you sort of think about a bank, the complexities of running a bank and the scale of running a bank, it's really important for directors to be across a lot of information. You've got report backs from committees and the like. So it could be hundreds and hundreds of pages over the 3 days. For a small company though, you should be very clear on what your papers are, and your pack should be 60 to 120 pages for us, our quarterly meeting. We're running through the entirety of the business.
And how far in advance would the board expect to get them?
Best practice is 7 days. The big but though is if you've got a lot of policies to approve or your annual forecast financials where there's a lot of thinking required, then those papers should go out much earlier, and often you can invite directors to make comments well in advance of the board meeting. So when you get to the board meeting, it's a matter of being able to have a succinct conversation and approve those papers rather than lots of toing and froing and querying. So best practice 7 days before the meeting to give the directors time to think about it, and that's really important. So it's not a matter of directors just reading the papers once. It's a matter of them reading the papers, thinking about the strategy, thinking about the context of business, thinking about the value that they bring to the business outside of the actual business itself and their wider knowledge, and then how can they bring that to bear in the papers themselves.
Right, so certainly a lot of preparation, as earlier conversations have come out with, is, as you say, read the board papers more than once. You're looking at, as you say, 120 papers, and in some larger companies, much larger packs. So 7 days minimum would be helpful to get through and digest that stuff, right? And then in the meantime, of course, they're doing all their background reading and things as well. Interesting point that you make. If there's policies and things to be discussed, if there's anything very complex, then having the opportunity to discuss them with the chair or other board members and ask questions in advance, go back to management and have some time for it to go to and fro a bit, so the board meeting itself can be more succinct. Is understandable. What types of board papers are there? You see on board packs, for example, I and A and D, and what are they?
Yeah, so I think when I look at how do you put together a really good board pack is if you just put aside all the usual governance type papers I talked about earlier on, but you've got to have key papers on your strategy. What are you delivering to your strategy, and then outside of that you'll have cooperation reports, you'll have your finance reports, and depending on the nature of the business, you could have a detailed report on what's happening with your technology stack, what's happening with your data, or how you're utilising your data. And one thing I like to do is have a theme for most meetings. Do you have one of your major regions presenting to one of your major areas of your business presenting, and getting people into the room and talking about their part of the business? So I think you've got to make sure you get enough information to your directors so they can make really good decisions, so they can have a good overview of the business. But remember, it's governance, not management. So you shouldn't be putting too much detail in, but also having that mix around themes or papers, or getting people in from the business to actually present specific parts of the business, and it can be different at every meeting.
Right. The letters I was alluding to when I mentioned I information only, D decision, and A action. And yes, as you say, that concept that you've just raised about having a deep dive each board meeting is one that I've come across before, particularly with Henry Lynch. He's very big on that concept as well, of having one area of the business to dive into. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So just on your IAD, specifically, my view is your papers are for information or noting, the one and the same thing, or for approval.
Yes.
There's another third concept which I'd like to introduce, which is for endorsement. So that's a situation where it's really important that the board is aware of the paper and the content, but it's not actually a governance decision. It's management responsibility, but you've got to make sure that the board is supportive of what you're doing, given the nature, whether it's a licensing, a regulatory obligation, or something that's really important and goes to the heart of the company. But it is actually management decision, and management shouldn't be devolving that responsibility to the board, because that's within delegation of authority.
Right, but a little bit more, so it's a little bit more than keeping the board informed, as you mentioned before, and a little bit less than ratifying a decision.
Nuanced.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's an interesting thing to raise. Thank you. How long is an optimal board paper?
There's a fantastic saying, I didn't have time to write a short paper, so I wrote a long paper instead. What I try and do with papers and encourage my teams to do is no more than 2 or 3 pages for the substantive paper. So you've got to be very clear on the information given to the board and what you're asking of them. Often it's important that that is backed up in appendices with tables, statistics, graphs, those sort of things to give the board the context. But again, remember, it's governance, not management. So if you can't tell a board exactly what you need to tell them, to give them the right information within 2 or 3 pages, then you kind of thought about it hard enough. And as you said, having been in large listed companies, that's a practice we ran, and it worked phenomenally well.
So 2 or 3 pages for the paper, but then having supporting information that the director's coming through. That quote's quite funny. It comes, of course, from Blaise Pascal, who said, "I'd have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time." I do like that quote, and it's very true. If you blat stuff out and just keep typing, it ends up being this monster, and it's the skill of cutting it down to the various inches that takes the time, isn't it?
It's got to be succinct rather than a stream of consciousness, because if you have a stream of consciousness or too much information, you're going to lose the wood for the trees. The directors will say, actually, you've put a whole lot of information in here. What are you actually asking me?
Yes, right. So what's usually covered in a board paper?
So if I think about how I set up the paper, from physical paper, always start with a recommendation.
Yes.
And so it's very clear from the outset, the board know exactly what you're asking. You're recommending them approval to A, B and C, and that they must note D, E and F. Then under that, I usually will have an overview. So within a couple of paragraphs, a succinct overview of the background, key information that you want to put to directors. And then if there's background information that's specific, say precursor or decisions over the previous 1 or 2 years that relate to why you're doing that, put the background in. Then any other substantive information required. And then I like having a heading called key risks.
Yes.
So what risks have you identified that the board must be aware of in making this decision? Is it a positive or is it a negative? And then the next part is next steps. So what is the board required to do, or is management required to do as part of the next steps if the board approve it?
Right, that certainly makes a lot of sense. The point about risks, when you're making a decision, you're talking about something that is uncertain, and you're making a recommendation saying, we think it should go this way, but the board wants to know what could go wrong. So keeping them informed of all those things that you've identified as risks, to give the opportunity for the board to say, well, actually, have you thought about these things as well?
Absolutely, and that's going back to your skills matrix on the board. So every board member is in there because they've got a different skill set, and they'll be looking at the papers differently. And so it's really important. But coming back to the actual form of the board paper, having a standard format means the board know exactly where to look for what information, and they'll know if superfluous information has been put in, but it's very clear to them what has been recommended. What's the overview, what's the background, any other key information they need to know, and then key risks and next steps.
Yeah.
And if they follow that same heading, or if management follow the same heading in all papers, then the board have a construct.
Yes, certainly value for that, so consistency. How much detail is needed? Now, you've just given the overview of the 3 pages. You're not going to get a huge amount of detail in 3 pages unless you're writing 2-point font. But in the appendices, how much detail do you give the board to support those?
Again, it really depends on the papers. So, if you are talking about a fundamental change in strategy, well, then you probably should have had a strategy day before that. But you're going to want really strong supporting data. It could be a number of tables with financial data or analysis that you've done, or risk matrices, or it could be BCG matrix, or whatever it is. Other times there may not need to be much at all. If you're talking about a sales and marketing led organisation, then you'd want your core dashboard around what sales from what regions and what quantities, what's come through online means, what's coming through over the counter, all your different channel breakdowns, that sort of stuff, and often trends over time. And I'm a big fan of your line graphs. What is your trend over time? How does it compare to last year? What are the other nuances? And you'd have arrows pointing in to go, 30% down this year compared to last year because of X crisis or floods or whatever it is. And so anomalies can be picked up as well. And you could take paragraphs and paragraphs to explain that in the content of your document, but by having it in a graph with one arrow, you've just summarised why is this quarter flat compared to last quarter.
Yeah, so I came through my career as an analyst, and that ability to identify what you're trying to highlight in charts and graphs is a really key element for an analyst, rather than just saying, here's a chart. Well, so what?
Picture tells 1,000 words, but it's got to have context.
Absolutely, right. And so you've established there that some board papers are going to be longer than others. Can you give some examples of when you might have particular types of papers, or some other examples of where you might have some particular types of papers that will sort of have to be more chunky?
Yeah, being in the financial services industry at the moment with all the extra obligations, getting risk and compliance papers to be succinct is quite challenging because there are so many different metrics that you have to cover off, and then on top of that, you need to cover your health and safety. That must be covered. Complaints is a really important one. The board needs to be seeing what complaints are coming through and how they're being addressed. And if you go through, what the Financial Services Council has put out around best practice and what the FMA has put out around, particularly FMA around, what should be going to a meeting, there's a lot of details that they're expecting directors to know. Now, it doesn't have to be in the body of the paper, but having those in appendices, and again, red, amber, green dashboard's really important.
So if I want to open a board pack from a company like that, I'd probably expect, as you say, 8 to 10 items, 2 to 3 pages for each substantive paper. So you might end up with, plus all your previous minutes and so forth, you probably end up with about 30 to 40 pages of the substantive board pack, and 200 or 300 pages of appendices, or 100 pages, depending on what's being discussed.
Yeah, so I think that's it's really easy for a board pack to go from what you planned of being 50 or 60 pages to just another page here, this, that graph. Pie graphs take up a lot of space, and you end up at 120 pages.
Yes.
So it's really the role of your company secretary and your CEO or MD to go and say, is this really required? And I know staff over the years often wait for it, and I go, you need to halve this paper, or you haven't told a clear enough story, or you don't need to focus on this, you should focus on that, or 6 months ago we told the board this, you've just told them a different story. If there's a good reason for that, you've got to link it.
Right.
But they can go back and have a look at that previous paper if they want to. You don't have to tell them the whole previous paper. So again, being succinct is really important, but also remember it's governance, not management. So management, the reporting to management should be a lot more comprehensive. And then for governance, it's tops of the way is what do the board need to know about how the business has been running? What information do they need to know to make a decision?
Actually, one very detailed question that came to my mind while we were talking earlier. Is it common in those appendices or in the board papers to include some external sources? To say, to the directors, if you want to read more about this, here's a IMF paper or something like that, is it?
Yeah, you can. But if you've got it in a board portal, don't hyperlink it because then they can't get access to it. One thing I tend to do is either send that to directors or refer it to, in particular if you're using a board portal, you've got a governance documents or a board reading room.
Right.
Yeah, if there's really good information, which you don't want to put a 20-page report into your board pack, say the company paper or supporting paper for this is included in the governance docs, the board reading room, and directors can go and have a look at that.
Right. Well, one final question for you, off topic a little bit. In your long career, really, in governance, what is the best advice you've received?
On running a board or coming onto a board?
Actually, choose one.
Yeah. So a very wise chairman once said to me, he said, Craig, the most important decision you have to make when you're being invited on a board is be careful of the company you keep, because you're there and you've got just as much accountability as everyone else on that board, and so you better make sure that if you're going to be putting your name to a board and go and invest a whole lot of time to support that company and help improve that company and support shareholders' needs and customers' needs, he said, you're only as strong as your weakest link on that board. So do your due diligence not only on the company, but on the directors as well.
That's really interesting to pull out. Thank you very much, Craig.
Pleasure.
Great conversation. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'll look forward to seeing you next episode. Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.